we knew we were going to expatriate at some point, but we had a few more years of work before we did that. So we actually prepared with changing our domicile to Texas. Texas is one of the 8 states, as you mentioned, that does not have state taxes.
Mi amigo, Randy Lagman. Hey, Randy, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you today?
Good, man. Thanks for doing this. So we have a special podcast today because we're going to be talking about um, what you need to do to prepare yourself before you move overseas, and it's a strategy and it's a way to save or avoid paying taxes in the U.S. and it's perfectly legal. It's changing your domicile if need be. But we're going to get into that. Randy is a specialist on this because he's done it. So Randy, we've already done a podcast and it's called Retire in Colombia, Coffee Country on 1,000 per month. You can see that on the Adventure Freaks YouTube channel. And Randy lives in this beautiful coffee region of Colombia, and it's absolutely stunning. So check that YouTube podcast out. And today we're going to, again, talk about what you need to do prior to moving overseas, how to change your domicile, which is your state of residence, to avoid paying taxes. And it's perfectly legal. So, Randy, okay, so you initially, before you were ready to move overseas, you guys were just RVing it, and you identified 8 states that allow you to change the domicile. Share a little bit about what that is, what the domicile means for people, in the importance of changing that so that they can strategically avoid having to pay the taxes here in the U.S.
Sure. And taxes is certainly one big part of it, and I'll talk about that in pretty much depth. But there are other things that are affiliated with or associated with your domicile as well. So basically, there are eight states that do not have a state income tax. Now, when you have a residence, when you have a house, like for example, I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, I had to file a Wisconsin tax return. I had to file a federal return. But I was working for a company that allowed teleworking. So my spouse and I decided that we were going to basically chuck it all, get rid of the house, get rid of the stuff, move into an RV. We bought a 5th wheel and a truck, and we decided to be digital nomads in the US. Now, we knew we were going to expatriate at some point, but we had a few more years of work before we did that. So we actually prepared with changing our domicile to Texas. Texas is one of the 8 states, as you mentioned, that does not have state taxes.
Yes.
My employer at the time had a location in Texas. So I contacted my employer and I say, I'm going to be in Texas, so change my address to Texas. Okay, good. So they did all my taxes as though I was a Texas resident. I was no longer a Wisconsin resident. I didn't have a house there. So the employer filed all of my tax forms from an employer perspective. You have to file the FICA and FUTA and SUTA and all of that stuff as though I was a Texan, because I had a Texas address.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's an important part of it, is you have to get an official address that will be accepted by your employer, or if you're self-employed, you can do this freely, in the state that you want to change your domicile to. And you have to make a reasonable effort to associate yourself with that state. You can't just put up your hand and say, oh, I'm a Texan. No, it's more than that. You have to get a driver's license. So you have to go there, right? If you're an out of state, most states will require you to physically be there to get a driver license.
Mm-hmm.
You have to change your vehicles if you own vehicles. If you're traveling, of course, you'll have vehicles. Change your vehicle registration. And usually they require an inspection. So you have to bring your vehicle there.
Yeah.
And change your insurance, your car insurance, your auto insurance, to reflect your new address in your new state. And as much as you can do to paint a picture of truly wishing to associate with the new state. So if you need a doctor's appointment, make it in the state you want to go to. I'm just going to use, I'm going to say Texas a lot here because that's what I did, but
Sure.
pick your state. There are 8 of them.
Yeah.
Florida's another big one. A lot of
let me read them out. So the 8 states are Alaska, Florida, Nevada, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming. And I'm going to list them in the podcast.
Yeah. So those are your 8. So you need to make a plausible effort to convince the authorities that you're actually intending to become a resident of that state, right?
Yeah.
So driver's license, vehicle registration, insurance, doctor's appointments, dentist, whatever it is you want to do, the more you can say, because what'll happen is the state that you're coming from, they're not going to want you to do this because, and they can't stop you, but they're going to make you prove it. Okay. So when we left when we left Wisconsin, California is a totally different story. They're greedy. But when we left Wisconsin, when I didn't file a return, they said, "Oh, you obviously forgot," right? They contacted me and I said, "Well, I'm in Texas now." And they said, "Oh, well, you have to prove it, right? You have to prove you're no longer in Wisconsin because we want our tax." And so I had to say, "Okay, well, here's my driver license, here's my vehicle registration, here's all of this stuff." And then Wisconsin finally let go and said, "Okay, fine, you're a Texan."
Randy, let me ask you this question: when
Sure.
you became a resident of Texas,
Mm-hmm.
and you're saying, "I got a driver's license," you have to have an address.
That's right.
Did you purchase a place? Did you get an apartment? How did you do that?
Good, excellent question. There are several, and I can talk about 2 states for sure. Maybe 3. There are several companies that will do virtual mail addresses that are considered acceptable.
Okay.
So in Texas, there's a service called usglobalmail.com, usglobalmail.com. Okay. And they have a service where you can get a what appears to be a real street address, and they have a physical address, and it has the address of their business, and I have an apartment number which associates with my mailbox. And that's the address that's on my driver license, my vehicle registrations that I had. I sold them when I moved it to Colombia. But that's also the address that's on my 1040, my tax return, right? Okay. So it is a virtual address, but it is a real address. It's not a P.O. box. P.O. box will not work. You have to find somebody who does a mail service. And I know there's another company called Escapees. That caters Escapees. Yeah. They cater more to RVers, but it works quite well as well. And they have addresses in Texas and Florida for sure. They may have them in other states. If your viewers are interested in, say South Dakota or Alaska or whatever, you'll need to investigate where you can get an address, but you need an address, right? Because you have to show the address, and you have to start somewhere with showing that you have a legitimate address.
Okay. Right? So you basically contacted this company, and they can strategically create a virtual address in Texas, indicating that you are a resident there. Yes. And they will collect and receive any mail that comes to that particular address. Yep. How do they get that mail to you? Do they send it directly, or do they scan it and send it via email?
Yeah, I'll tell you what US Global Mail does. And Escapees is very similar because I started with Escapees and then we switched to US Global Mail. Okay. What they do is when they receive a piece of mail, they will take a photo of it or a scan of just the front of the mail or the front of the magazine or whatever it is you get, a picture of the package. And they'll send you an email and they'll say you have mail. So you log on to their site with your user ID and password, and you can see the picture of the front of the mail. And you can look at it and you can say, okay, well, this is a piece of junk mail, throw it out. And they'll throw it out immediately. So you click on it, you say discard. Okay. You can say open it and scan it. And then they'll open the letter or the box or the package or whatever, and they'll scan the contents. And you can limit it to, only scan the first 3 pages or whatever. So you can give them instructions so you don't have this huge bill. Because of course, they charge for their services, right?
Sure.
they're going to charge for receiving the mail. They're going to charge for per page for scanning. And I don't remember the cost. They're published on their website. You can take a look at it. But you can say, okay, open that and scan it. And then usually they turn it around within 1 business day. And then they send you another email saying, your scan is done. So you can log onto the site, you can go look at it, and it shows up as a PDF. So if you get an official letter of something that you need to have a copy of, you can download the PDF, put it in Evernote or put it wherever you manage your documents. And you don't have to physically send anything. And then after you download it, you can say destroy it or shred it or whatever you want to do with it. With physical things that you have to have, like there's only 2 things I actually had to have them physically send to me. And that was a replacement credit card, because obviously a picture is not going to suffice, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And a replacement part for a travel trunk. There was a wheel that was defective. But other than that, in, 4 years of using mail services, those are the only 2 things I've ever needed to have physically sent to me.
Okay.
So
what do they charge to obtain that residency? What do they charge per month to use that service?
Again, you can look at the sites and get the current pricing, but it seems to me, memory serves, it's somewhere around $100 a year.
Oh, wow. So it's very reasonable.
It is very reasonable. And then they charge you per piece of mail they handle, right? If they receive it and discard it, there's no charge. But if they open it and scan it,
it's a lot cheaper than getting a lease on an apartment in Texas somewhere.
It sure is. Yeah, and that works real well. Like I said, U.S. Global Mail is a good service, and they are particularly well suited for expatriates. Escapees is a very good service as well. They are more catered to the domestic RVing community.
Okay,
but they have hundreds of thousands of customers that they collect and manage mail for.
Okay, so you set this domicile up in Texas after leaving Wisconsin. So your state of residency.
No. That's the important thing. You have to do this first. As you started out with this podcast, you said there's a strategy that you have to plan ahead for this.
Okay.
You got to get your address first.
Okay.
You got to know where you're going to go for your domicile. You have to get your address first. You have to go there, make a case for being a resident, get your driver license, bring your car or cars there, get them registered, and then you move, right? But you have to do this all before you go.
You go. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And if you're going to expatriate, you certainly have to do all this before you leave the country. I mean, that's absolutely required. And this takes a while. In our case, it probably took us 4 or 5 months.
Oh, okay. Good.
Everything set up.
Okay. So it takes about 4 to 5 months.
Yeah. It might be longer depending on the state, but for us, that's what it was. I mean, I had to drive from Wisconsin to Texas with my truck.
Yeah.
And have it inspected and licensed and get new license plates and all that stuff. So, there's a process, and you got to kind of plan ahead. You can't just say, oh, I'm leaving next week. Well,
yeah, every state is a little bit different. I remember when I moved to New York, it was a year it took before I became a resident.
Yeah.
So even though
sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah, it takes a while. It's different everywhere. Okay, that's good information. So now that you are a resident of Texas, they don't charge this state income tax, which saves you. You literally avoid having to pay those taxes, which you would have had to pay if you were still a resident of Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's right. And Wisconsin tax is notoriously high. I mean, it's not as bad as California, but it's quite high. It's in the top 10 most expensive in the country. So, saving that on while we were RVing was a substantial savings for us.
Okay. Can you break this down a little bit more simplistically to help the viewers understand the benefits of doing this?
Sure. There are several. The taxes we've talked about quite a bit. You move to a state that doesn't have state taxes, you don't pay state taxes. That's a pretty simple thing. The other things that are important that you need to investigate on the state you're considering is, what is the cost of auto insurance? because you may save on state taxes, but you may find that the underwriting for the insurance companies is much higher than where you're coming from. So you could end up paying a lot more in auto insurance. So that's one thing to look at.
Okay.
The other thing that's really important, and getting more and more important as the politics in the U.S. become more involved, is voting. Whatever your state of domicile is the state in which you must vote. So you can't just, be traveling around and say, oh, I'm going to hop into Virginia and I'm going to vote because I'm a U.S. citizen. You can't do that. Your state of domicile is where you officially vote. So if you plan on RVing, or if you plan on expatriating and you're going to be in another country, you're going to have to look at the state that you're considering and what their absentee voting requirements and laws are, to see if it's going to work for you. I remote vote, I absentee vote from, in Texas, from here in Colombia. So, so if you're really focused on voting, and everyone, all of us citizens should be, you have to look at that as well.
Okay.
So, and then your federal tax return, you'll need to change the address on that as well. And you don't have to do a change of address per se. You just, the next time you do a 1040, you just put the new address on, and that's okay, right?
Okay.
So those are the big things: taxes, expenses for insurance, and voting. Those are really the big things that you want to consider before you change your domicile. And if you're going to be expatriating to another country, all of this has to be set up before you leave. And you have to have filed at least one 1040 before you leave, right? For federal taxes. Okay. And you have to have a driver's license and insurance and all of that stuff before you leave. Because otherwise the state that you left prematurely, they're just going to keep hounding you for taxes. And you're probably, with the voting thing, you also have to register to vote, right? You have to change your registration. Yeah. And you can't register to vote until you have an ID. Right. And the ID needs to be a driver license or something similar. Right? So it's a process.
Okay. So do you have any kind of figure in your mind of how much this saves individuals? No,
moving? I don't.
No?
And the reason I say that is because it depends on which state. I'll tell you, in Wisconsin, as I mentioned, the Wisconsin tax is very high. Yeah. The income tax. California is insanely high. And if you have viewers that are considering changing their domicile from California to one of these non-tax states, that is a very complicated process. In fact, California has recently introduced legislation, I don't know if it was passed, that they are going to try to continue to charge ex-residents income tax even after they leave. They're going to penalize them and say, no. Once you're here, you can't leave. You still owe us money. Yeah. So disentangling from California is going to be much more difficult, but it'll save you a lot more money than say, Kentucky. Kentucky is pretty low taxes, whereas Wisconsin is, in the top 10 in the nation. So if your viewer will look at your tax return, look at your 1040 and look at your tax return, your state tax return, and whatever you're paid for state tax, well, you're going to save at least that. And then you look at, call some insurance agents in the state that you're considering changing your domicile to, and tell them that you're planning on moving there, and what would the insurance be for the car. Tell them what kind of car you have and what your record is, and they'll give you a quote. Yeah. I would
think that most people moving overseas are going to sell their car.
Yes, right. But before you leave, you're probably still going to have a car.
True.
Until you get on the airplane and sell your car. I actually sold my car on the way to the airport.
Wow.
So it was I sold it to a dealer. So yeah, but you need to have insurance the whole time, and you need to have the insurance through that transition of your domicile. So if you're going to change your domicile to another state and you have to do that in advance, you're going to have some number of weeks or months in the new domicile that while you still have a vehicle. Right.
Yes.
And that insurance is going to have to be enforced while you do that. So it's for a short time for expatriates. Of course, it's for a short time, but it can it can add up if you go to a state that's notoriously high for car insurance premiums.
Yeah, it sounds like this would be hugely beneficial for people who are converting vans into their living quarters and are traveling around the U.S. or RVing
Absolutely.
around the U.S. where, if you identify one of these states and say, yeah, I'm gonna become a resident of that state because now I'm just living out of my van or I'm living out of my RV.
That's what we did, and that's why we first started it. And I discovered after RVing and after benefiting from changing my domicile to Texas while we were RVing, I also discovered that expatriating from a non-tax state is highly beneficial as well. So for us, it was the other way around. We knew we were going to expatriate, but we did it for RVing purposes. And for 4 years,
oh wow,
we lived in an RV and we didn't have a regular home. We had this virtual address in Texas, and we visited 22 states in 4 years and never paid a dime of income tax, of state income
tax. Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah, and I just want to do a real quick call out. Escapees, I mentioned earlier, they have a terrific service. They're not necessarily keyed into expats because they don't do a lot of international shipping. If you need to get your credit card or get something physically to you, they have kind of a hard time with that. However, they do everything else I told you. They will send you an email when you get something. They'll give you a picture. You can choose to scan it. You can choose to destroy it, all of that stuff. And here's the other thing, very important. Escapees has a legal service that is part of the Escapees organization that happens to also be in Texas, by the way, Livingston, Texas. And they have an entire practice with a couple of attorneys who do nothing but help with domicile, changing your domicile.
What's the website name? Do you know? Is it
it's escapees.com. Yeah, escapees.com.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. And you'll often see them referred to as SKP, the letter S, the letter K, the letter P.
Okay.
Although that's not their website, but they call themselves Escapees.
Oh wow. Okay.
And it's a terrific organization. Like I said, it's more geared to domestic digital nomad working and domicile, but they're a terrific place to start. And they have addresses. They have virtual addresses in Texas and Florida for sure. They may have other states as well.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
Good organization. And that's where we started. And the thing is, you want to think about this whole thing well in advance. At least 6 months before you expatriate, and at least one tax filing cycle. Right? Get at least one April 15th or whatever the tax day is. At least one federal tax return filed with your new address. And then you can do things like register to vote and get your driver's license and all that stuff. But it takes a while. And it's not something you're going to just do in a week. It's going to take 6 months, or in your case, you said it took you a year to become a resident of New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So it's just preparing for, you're not going to be here anymore. You're going to go somewhere else, but you still have to maintain that connection to whatever your domicile state is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Cool. Well, I hope this helps.
This was brilliant, man. This was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, no problem. Happy to help. And we'll see if we have any other topics to do podcasts in the future. It's fun.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So Randy Lagman, he's living in coffee country, Colombia. Check out the podcast that we did earlier. And thanks again, sir, for doing this. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Good day.